Hello there, and welcome to this fast track video. In this fast track video, we're going to be teaching you about audio equipment. Each video is going to be very different, and it's going to dive deep into specific audio equipment. In these training videos, we're going to show you who uses this particular audio equipment, why it's used, how to use it, as well as specific technical jargon that might confuse you or that you might not know about. So without further ado, let's jump into this training video and learn more about audio equipment.
Let's begin by having a look at what is a MIDI controller. A MIDI controller is a device used to send and receive MIDI information from itself to another device. This can be synthesizers, samplers, effect units, drum machines, and computer software. Although MIDI instruments are primarily designed to send musical information such as music notes, volume, expression, and sustain, modern MIDI devices can also be used to send information such as transport control, rotary, and fader information. With this, users are able to control DAWs and software instruments. This means that a MIDI controller does not have to have any musical keys or pads. Let's now learn more about MIDI controllers, such as who would use one, why are they necessary, an overview of what a few typical MIDI devices have, and more. Let's begin. Let's take a look at the types of MIDI controllers that are available. Let's begin with instrument MIDI controllers such as a keyboard MIDI controller. These are commonly 32, 49, 61, or 88 keys. In the form of a 32, 49, or 61 key MIDI controller, these are usually synth action-like keyboards. However, many manufacturers that manufacture 88 key MIDI controllers have hammer action keys like a real piano. These MIDI controllers generally contain musical functions such as pitch bend, modulation, and sustain. Next, electronic drum kits. These can also be used as MIDI controllers, meaning that if the user is not happy with the stock standard sounds that come with the drum module, the user can connect the drum kits to a drum machine or to their computer and use the sounds that are generated there. Believe it or not, there are also wind and string instrument style MIDI controllers for users to play back sounds from different sound generating devices. This is mainly for users that are comfortable playing woodwind or guitar, for example. Here are some examples of these devices. Next, we have DAW or parameter type controllers. These controllers can be used to change parameters in devices in the form of a sound module, synthesizer, or VST plugin. Users can use these controllers to change control parameters that are specific, such as the envelope, filter controls, oscillator controls, LFO controls, and more. These controllers can also be used to control both hardware and software effect units in the same manner. Utilizing controllers in a DAW will mainly allow users to control their instruments and effects, as well as actual mixing consoles and mixing console parameters, such as transport controls, editing, effects, and more. Some DAW controllers are wide enough in range of controls. You have the opportunity to work with the DAW and cut down on the amount of time spent using your computer keyboard and mouse. Last but not least, we have pad controllers. These are generally square pads grouped in either 8, 16, 24, or 32 pads. These pads contain musical notes and are mostly used to play back drum samples or sampled sounds. These controls have become more and more prominent for non-keyboard players and finger drummers. Now that we have covered the different types of MIDI controllers, let us have a look at who would use a MIDI controller. There are a lot of different types of MIDI controller users, and since there are many uses for MIDI controllers, many people who use them without even knowing they are using a MIDI controller. These people may include, but are not limited to, music producers, sound engineers, musicians, podcasters, sound designers, video editors, VJs, DJs, animators, radio presenters, and many more. The most common use for a MIDI controller in today's world would be in software, and as long as a piece of software can recognize a MIDI controller as a control method, then the user is able to control the software with it. Now that we have looked at who would use a MIDI controller, let us have a look at why MIDI controllers are used and are useful. Let's have a look at why someone would want to use a MIDI controller. Here are some of the reasons. To control parameters in hardware instruments and effect units that are not available for control on the device. To control software instruments and effect units instead of using a keyboard and mouse. To send musical notes to both hardware and software instruments. To trigger transport control events in a software or hardware environment. To create a master and slave tempo between two devices. To change behavior of a software or hardware instrument. And last but not least, to trigger an on and off event such as to switch a video on and off in VJing software. Now that we've gone over why, let's move over to the next section of this video. Let's do a brief overview on how to work with a MIDI controller within a DAW. For this example, I'll be using Ableton Live. However, keep in mind that although this is one DAW, most DAWs work the same and have the same type of functions and features that will work in any DAW. The terminology may be slightly different, however, the principles will still remain the same. I will start off by connecting a MIDI controller via USB to a computer. Now that the connections are done, let's jump into the DAW and get to work. I will now go into the Preference or Settings section for Windows users of Ableton Live. Let's begin with the Input section. Live will list all the available MIDI inputs, whether they are USB or MIDI to USB based. By selecting the track option, Live will be able to receive MIDI notes into the software. The Sync option allows for Live to receive a MIDI clock. This means that if the particular MIDI device has a clock built in, and can send a MIDI clock out to control the tempo of the DAW, this can be useful for controlling tap tempo by means of tap tempo. Last but not least, if this particular MIDI controller is a DAW style controller that has faders, rotaries or buttons that can be used to control the DAW, then the remote function will come into play. This allows users to map functions from the controller to their DAW. Since this is a simple MIDI keyboard controller, I will simply select the track option and start inputting notes into the software. Now that this has been proven successful, I can now start making music. Remember, although this was done in Ableton Live, this is very similar whether you're using Steinberg's Cubase, ImageLine's Fruity Loops, or FL Studio, as well as Propellerhead's Reason. We have now come to the end of working with the MIDI controller in a DAW setting. Let's move on and have a look at how to pick a MIDI controller. Picking a MIDI controller can be really easy based on application, needs, and wants. Let's go over different scenarios that could help set up the foundation for picking a MIDI controller. For a portable MIDI controller that's keyboard based and has some additional controls, a MIDI controller with keys, pads and rotaries serves as a very good tool for anyone wanting to produce music on the go. On the screen we have some examples of these controllers, and the biggest portability factor of these MIDI controllers is that they are USB based, meaning they do not require power. Some of these controllers are also class compliant, meaning they do not require drivers and can connect up to a mobile device or tablet. These MIDI controllers generally start off at around 1,000 Rand and can climb all the way up to roughly 3,000 Rands. Bigger than a 25 key MIDI controller would be a 49 or 61 key MIDI controller. Let's look at the most basic of these MIDI controllers, which mainly comes with just keys and some musical functions such as sustain, pitch bend and modulation. These MIDI controllers are very popular with producers that are getting started in music production, as they are budget friendly and do not have any complicated features and functions. These MIDI controllers start off at roughly 2,000 Rands and climb up to roughly 4,000 Rands. A step up from these MIDI controllers would include drum pads, rotaries and faders, as well as transport control. These become all-round DAW controllers for music production and can control many aspects that are available within the DAW. These MIDI controllers generally start off at roughly 3,000 Rand and can go all the way up to 15,000 Rand based on the features and functions they may have. Next up, we have drum pads such as the one seen on screen. These MIDI controllers are great for finger drumming or MPC style of music production. Some come with software attached to them that can turn the MIDI controller into a complete music production system. For example, like the Akai MPC and the Native Instruments Machiner, which can be used as a plugin within a DAW or a limited DAW on its own. Alternatively, pad MIDI controllers can also be standard MIDI controllers. These MIDI controllers start off at roughly 3,000 Rand and can go all the way up to 25,000 Rand. Next, we have DAW controllers. These are specifically designed to control functions in a DAW, such as transport control, the mixer, and the plugins. The biggest drawcard to MIDI controllers designed for DAWs would be the faders being motorized. This means the faders will automatically move up and down based on the fader position that is in the mixer in the DAW. This in turn determines how much the controller can be hands-off from the computer keyboard and mouse, which is what a lot of users will look for when shopping around for a DAW style MIDI controller. These controllers can consist on 1 motorized faders, or they can consist of 16 motorized faders. DAW controllers generally start off at roughly 4,000 Rands and can go all the way up to 20,000 Rand. Last but not least, for anyone that's looking for a MIDI controller to control instruments that do not resemble traditional instruments but work either to assist users to create music in a unique playing style or have added features in making musical instruments more expressive and interesting, some of these examples on screen include the Akai Fire, the Roly Seaboard, as well as the Ableton Push. Since these are specialist MIDI controllers, users should do a little bit more research before committing to one, as the starting price roughly starts off at about 4,000 Rand, all the way up to 50,000 Rand depending on the manufacturer. That is it for how to pick a MIDI controller. Let's move on to the next section of this video.
Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned a lot and I hope you enjoyed it. If there was anything you didn't understand, feel free to drop me an email at the email address at the end of this video. Thank you once again for watching and I hope to see you again next time. Take care and bye-bye.